Hello, I'm Dr. Richard Ruth, and today's lecture is on how a CEO selects, organizes, and manages his senior leadership team. So how does all this start anyway? Let's consider a publicly traded company. It's a private company, but its stock is available on the stock market. When you go to E-Trade, or Schwab.com, or whatever brokerage service you might use, and you buy stock in a company, why are you doing that? Well, if you're like everybody else I've ever met, you're doing that because you think the value of the stock is going to increase over time, or the company is going to pay great dividends. But basically, you're wanting to see the value of the company increase, and you think it will. And what's another name for stockholder? Owner. So the owners of the company have an expectation that the company's value is going to increase because that's going to increase their investment. After all, think about this for a minute. If you didn't think a company was going to increase in value, but it was going to decrease in value, would you buy stock in that company? Yes, let's see. I think I'm going to pay $60 a share for 1,000 shares of stock right now. That's going to cost me $60,000. And I think that a year from now it's going to be worth $55,000. So great idea. No, nobody does that. The only reason people buy stock in a company is because they think the stock price has a reasonably good chance of going up. So if you're going to buy $60,000 worth of stock, you're expecting that a year from now that stock's going to be worth $65,000, $70,000 or somewhere north of that. That's why you buy stock. All right. So we start with the stockholder, who again we refer to as the owner. These are the owners of the company. And the stockholder, or the stockholders, elect a board of directors. And what's the job of the board of directors? The job of the board of directors is to make sure that the stockholders' investment is a good one. In other words, the board of directors' job is to make sure that the value of the company increases over time. An increase in stockholder equity, if you will. So what does the board of directors do with this mandate from the stockholders? They hire a CEO. And what's the CEO's primary job? The CEO's primary job is to increase stockholder equity, which is going to be measured normally by the stock price. Again, in some cases, the stock price can be held fairly constant as long as the company pays high enough dividends, but some combination of the two, increase in stock price or high dividends. Okay, so the CEO has as his metric of success to increase the stock price. And that's how he gets to keep his job, by the way. If the stock isn't going to go up in price, then the CEO is going to lose confidence from the board of directors, and the board of directors is going to replace him or her with some other CEO who they think can do that job. All right. So we start then with this mandate to the CEO. Your job is to increase stockholder equity. That's why we've given you the job. So how are you going to go about doing that? All right. Well, how does the CEO go about doing that? Basically, what makes the stock price go up? What makes the stock price go up is the investor analysts, the Wall Street gurus, get convinced that this is a good buy, and they make recommendations to their customers, their stockholder, their stock buying clients. They make recommendations to buy this company stock. So companies have ratings by the Wall Street analysts of buy, hold, or sell, usually. And you want your company to get lots of those guys to say buy. That's going to drive the buying public to purchase stock in your company, and the more the demand is for purchasing stock in your company, the higher the stock price is going to go. All right, so now this raises a question. What the CEO's got to do is he's got to convince the Wall Street analysts that the value of your company is going to be increasing. How does he do that? Basically, the CEO has to have a message that's multifaceted. One thing the CEO's got to talk about is he's got to talk about profits. So if the CEO can say to the Wall Street analysts that our profits are going to go up, and make some reasonable, credible prediction as to how much those profits are going to go up, and if the Wall Street analysts think that's an impressive value of increase, then they're going to tend to recommend buying your company's stock. That's just one indicator. That's not the only indicator. The CEO also, hopefully, is going to be talking about revenue increasing. Because it's possible for profits to increase without revenues to increase, and that can't happen for long. That could be due to temporary increases in efficiency in company operation, but it isn't going to happen for long. So the CEO not only needs to be talking about profits going up, but he needs to be talking about revenues going up. Now, along this line, revenues aren't going to go up for long unless you can do something about market share. So he also needs to be able to say, we're expecting that our market share is going to be increasing. And preferably what he's talking about is a track record. So over the last 12 months, we've seen profits increase by this much, we've seen revenue go up by this much, and we've seen our market share increase by so much. Now, in addition to that, we also have to talk about, he wants to talk about product creation. In other words, what are we going to do to improve the quality of our product and to increase its appeal to the marketplace? All right, so he has to talk about what's new coming up in the future. And then in addition to that, he has to talk about strategy. Strategically, what is the company planning on doing in the future that's going to put us in an even better position in these areas? All right, so this is the CEO's multi-pronged message that he wants to be able to take to Wall Street and to the stock buying public. Because if he can tell them this is going to go up a lot, this is going to go up a lot, this is going to go up an impressive amount, we're coming out with brand new products and services that we think are really going to wow the public, and we have a strategy that's going to be increasing market value for years to come. That's a great message. So that's basically the mandate that the CEO has. The CEO has to be able to tell this message. Now, the way he does that, like any good team leader, he goes and picks a senior leadership team that's focused, specialized in each of these areas. All right. So he's going to pick somebody who's specialized in making profits go up in the company. That person is called a CFO. Now, some observers who don't understand a CFO's role may be under the impression that the CFO's primary job is making sure that the accounting of the company happens right and that the company doesn't spend more money than it needs to be spending. That's not true. Those are tools. at the CFO's disposal to accomplish his real mission. His real mission is to make sure that the profits go up. And then he's going to hire somebody to be in charge of revenue. Let's make sure that we're hitting our revenue goals. Well, for the purpose of our lecture here, we're going to call this guy the VP of Sales. All right, so he goes and hires somebody who's very good at making revenue happen and gives him the job of making sure that happens. That's the VP of Sales. Somebody's got to be in charge of growing the market share. All right, that's the CMO's primary job. Okay, the CMO, he goes and hires somebody who's good at making market share increase, or that he has confidence in that can make the market share increase. And he assigns that person that job. Let's make the market share increase. Product creation. How do we make better and better products, and how do we do it more and more efficiently, and how do we make sure we're taking care, if we're a service sector company, we're taking good care of the customers, making sure they're happy with what we're doing. That's a customer satisfaction issue. And that person is the COO. So he goes and hires somebody that knows how to produce or deliver the products and services of the company in such a way that the customers like it. That's what the COO's job is all about. And strategy. Now this will surprise some of you, but in the large corporations, the large, successful, aggressively growing corporations, this is what the CIO's job is. The CIO's job is all about developing business strategy, working with the rest of the leadership team to develop a business strategy. Why the CIO? Well, we talked about that a little bit in the last lecture, the one on IT themes and trends. But basically, the CIO's job is to talk about how new investments, new large investments that the company is making have very high internal rate of returns and are going to be contributing significant value to the company in the future, and how we're going to be systematic about making that happen. All right. So, if you will, the CFO's job, or his success, if you will, is measured by profits. The VP of Sales success is measured by, is he hitting the revenue quotas? CMO's success is measured by market share increase. The COO's success is measured by customer satisfaction. If your company is a service sector company, and if you're primarily just a manufacturing company, then this is measured by product efficiencies. Which is that the quality is going up, typically measured in terms of defect rate, that the quantity is going up so that you can properly satisfy increased market demand, and that the cost is going down, measured in cost per unit manufactured and delivered to the customer. And then the COO is measured primarily based on the internal rate of return of the large IT systems that he or she has under development. All right, so this is one way to look at the task of how a CEO organizes a senior leadership team, why he selects those particular skills, and why he gives those particular people those KPIs, key performance indicators. And that's how he manages their success. And the whole reason that he's doing all this is because this is what it takes to deliver the message to the Wall Street analysts that we're increasing stockholder equity in the company. And why does he want to do that? Because that's what the board of directors has tasked him to do. And why did the board of directors task him to do that? It goes all the way back to the owners, because that's the expectation of the owners. All right, so that's how all this ties together. Now, what's this? The takeaway here is that if you are one of these people or planning on being one of these people, you have to understand what the whole game looks like and what your part in that game is. If you don't understand that, you can't play the role. Probably you'd never even get the job. Because part of the interview process is to make sure that you understand this dynamic, that you understand what your part on the team is that you have to play and how you have to perform, and you have to be convincing to the CEO that you can actually perform against those metrics of success, that KPI that he's giving you. All right. So let me redo this whole argument from a different perspective, and I think that will be instructive. So we're just sort of going to save this off to the side, and then we're going to come back and we're going to revisit and get to the same place by approaching this from a very different direction. Okay, so let me present this from a different perspective. We start with the basic business equation. Revenue minus expenses equals profit. So revenue, this is normally going to be sales. How much stuff your salespeople are selling for you. Expenses, this is payroll. It's benefits plan. It's raw materials. It's utilities, office space, equipment, IT, legal, blah, 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 blah. All right, so in a given year, let's say that your company has $1 billion in revenue, that they have $900 million in expenses. That's what all this adds up to. So this would end up generating $100 million in profit. Now there are all kinds of different ways to measure profit. I haven't told you, are we talking EBITDA here, or are we talking bottom line, or I mean whatever, but this is the concept that I want us to hold on to. All right. Now, back in the following World War II in this country, gigantic companies were built and managed on this model. And the CEO basically had to report to his stockholders and to Wall Street analysts the profits of the company. And the company was valued primarily based on its profits. So you get gigantic corporations like GM, for instance, General Motors, who in the 1960s and 1970s were basically using this model from the CEO's level, using this model to manage the company. So, for example, if in a particular year, because the economy was in a downturn, or for whatever other reason, revenues were going to be less, he couldn't afford to report lower profits, because that would cause the stock price to be devalued, and his job is at risk then. Again, it's not just his job. I don't mean to present this as a selfish view. He is responsible to the board of directors, who are responsible to the stockholders, to make sure that the stock price goes up. So his obligation to the owners of the company, the stockholders, is for the profits to go up. The 1960s, 1970s view of this. All right, so if sales are going to be down this year, then the only thing he can do to cause profits to go up is to decrease expenses. Well, if there's some fat in the budget, that may not be too difficult or too painful to do. But oftentimes, this is operating fairly efficiently here, and so what has to happen is you have to start cutting bone if this is what's driving you. So you would see companies like GM during down years making decisions about cutting pieces of their operation that are not in the long-term best interest of the company, not in the long-term health of the company, and not actually in the long-term best interest of the shareholders. Although, since that wasn't the way the game was played back then, oftentimes that view of what was happening in the company wasn't reported because no one cared. No one cared to look at it. Well, along came a guy about that time named Peter Drucker. And Peter Drucker said, you know what? You're going to build hollow companies if you keep operating on this business model. And you need to understand a company is not really all about making profits. Now, Peter Drucker, I don't believe ever said it this way, but think about it for a minute. If the only thing that your company was interested in was making profits, then you'd just be robbing banks. Okay, so obviously there are other things going on here besides just creating profits. Okay, there are social responsibility issues. There are self-esteem issues. There are integrity issues. There are, am I doing good things for the society, not just increasing my profits? And most CEOs, all CEOs I've ever known, think like that. I mean, they get that they're delivering value to the society and that is motivating them. Well, Drucker came along and he said, okay, y'all are using the wrong business model here. He wouldn't have argued that this is going on. He goes, yeah, no, I get this. But there's something else that you're overlooking that's actually more important than this number. And so Drucker came along and he started pulling the covers back, if you will, a little bit on this. It turns out there's other stuff up beyond here when we talk about business models. He started pulling the covers back here, and he said the primary objective of a company is creating customers. So Drucker would argue that the most important indicator of the health of a company and of the future value of the company is how it's doing in increasing the number of customers that it has. Okay, well that was kind of an interesting concept. It took a little while for that to catch on, but eventually it did, and people started buying what Drucker had to say, and they said, yeah, that's right. We need to focus more on creating customers. Well, since then, we've begun pulling the covers back even more. And we've changed what we call this now. I mean, well, it's still called creating customers, but basically we now recognize this as strategic revenue. Or, if you will, future revenue. So the reason that we want to create more customers is because that's going to generate more future revenue. And as I said, as we begin to pull the covers back here, we recognize that there's another equation up here. And we're now going to go back and call this one tactical. Which means, in this case, this fiscal year. Okay, so we have two different business models that the CEO has to manage now, happening simultaneously in the company. This fiscal year's revenue minus this fiscal year's expenses are going to produce this fiscal year's profit. Also, future fiscal years, the strategic view, future fiscal year revenue minus future fiscal year expenses equals future fiscal year profit. And these aren't necessarily going to correlate with each other. I mean, we don't have to sit and think for long before we could imagine all kinds of different scenarios where this year's revenues could be looking great, but future revenues could be looking terrible, or vice versa. This year's revenues are really in the tank, but once we get over this, whatever it is, this new product release in the market, or the economy shifts, or competitors go out of business and we start picking up market share, or whatever, for whatever the reason, our future revenues are looking great, even though this year revenues are not. Same thing is true with expenses. Even though we may have great efficiencies this year, that doesn't guarantee that our efficiencies in the future will be great, or vice versa. It might be that we've recognized that we have a need to improve our production efficiencies this year, and we're in the process of doing that. We're spending money this year to become more efficient, so that in the future, this number is going to look very good, even though this year it doesn't. And since this is dependent on these two, and this is dependent on these two, and since these can vary independent of the one below or above it, then obviously these don't necessarily correlate. So it's possible that this year's profits is looking great, but the next couple of years profits are looking lousy, or vice versa. This year's profits are not looking so hot, but 2 or 3 years out, we're going to be in great shape profit-wise. Well, it turns out that we're still not done. We need to pull the covers back some more, and what we discover is there's another one of these equations up here. Okay, there's another revenue minus expenses equals profit equation up here, and we're going to call this one investor perception. Okay, so basically the stock buying public and the Wall Street analysts, how do they perceive your revenue picture? How do they perceive your production efficiencies? And how do they perceive your future profit picture? Interestingly enough, this is the equation that drives the stock price. And also, each of these may operate independently of the ones below it. Now, I grant you that they probably shouldn't, but in fact they do. There are lots of examples in modern history when a company's this year's revenues are looking great. Next year's revenues will be great. We will know that in the future, and we can look back now. And let's take a company in 2008. At 2008, we may not know what the future revenues were going to be like, but by now we do. Okay. So the 2008 revenues were great. The 2009 through 2000 whatever revenues were actually going to be fine, but Wall Street may have thought, you know what, you're going to have revenue problem in the future. A lot of times, public relation issues will cause that perception. Sometimes a company can take a public relation hit and it will have a dramatic impact on future revenue. Sometimes a company takes a public relations hit and there may be a lot of fear in the investor community that this will cause a decrease in future revenues, but it doesn't. It just blows over and no one seems to notice and there's no long-term impact. And so that would be an example of when Wall Street guesses wrong. And so if they think your future revenue is going to go down, the stock may take a hit in the marketplace, and you could drop sometimes 10 or 20% almost overnight based on a public relations disaster. That when all the smoke clears and the years tick by, you go, you know, that was a nothing. That didn't actually come about. The same thing with expenses. They may view you in the future as either increasing your production efficiency or decreasing, when actually that's not the real story. And so consequently, the Wall Street opinion on what your profits and the value of your company in the future may be isn't always an accurate picture. All right. So it turns out that the CEO has to manage all three of these models, though. So how does he go about doing that? Well, same deal as before. He goes and picks champions. People on his senior leadership team that are specialized in each of these areas. And he assigns them, if you will. This is in concept here. We'll modify this concept later. Okay, he assigns them these jobs individually. So again, this year's revenue he assigns to the VP of Sales. He selects a VP of Sales and he measures his VP of Sales based on sales quota. This is his key performance indicator. And that's how he's going to manage his VP of Sales. So if the VP of Sales stays on quota, then the CEO has fairly good confidence that whatever the VP of Sales is doing, it must be right because he's staying on quota. If the VP of Sales starts drifting off of quota, then the CEO is going to spend more time and attention trying to figure out what's wrong over here and how can he help mentor the VP of Sales to fix it or get himself a new VP of Sales. Profit, again, he assigns to the CFO. And the CFO's key performance indicator is profit. We measure that directly. Okay, so the CFO can generate weekly, monthly, certainly quarterly views of what the profit looks like. And the CEO can just watch his metrics to get some sense for how good a job the CFO is doing. Most of the expenses are being incurred in operations. Now, I get that there are some exceptions to that here, but most of the expenses here, the lion's share of all that the company is spending on expenses are being spent by the COO. So the COO is the one that the CEO looks to manage this properly. And the COO, as we've said previously, actually there are two different key performance indicators depending on what kind of company you are. If you're a service sector company, yes, the CEO is looking at how the COO is doing in terms of staying on budget. A budget that's agreed to between the COO and the CFO. But the primary indicator of success, the key performance indicator for a COO in a service sector, company, is going to be customer satisfaction. On the other hand, in the manufacturing sector, the KPI for the COO is going to be production efficiency, which we've already talked about. All right, now in terms of strategic revenue, who does the CEO get to handle strategic revenue and how do we measure that? Well, this becomes the job of the CMO. And we measure future revenue. I mean, think about this for a moment. How do we measure today how good a job the CMO is going to be doing a year or two from now in terms of growing the size of the customer base? Interesting question. Since we don't deal with crystal balls, we have to have some business metric that gives us an indication of how the CMO is doing now and how that's going to impact the future. So we do that by measuring trends in the market share. So for instance, if the KPI that the CEO has given to the CMO at the beginning of the year is we want to have 2 points increase in our market share. So let's say that your market share last year was 34%. And the CEO comes to the CMO and says, okay, by the time we get to the end of the year, I want to be at 36%. So how could we tell if the CMO is on track? Well, one indication would be looking month by month to see how much the market share is increasing. And if it's not increasing by at least about 0.2% per month, then you're probably not going to make it. So we would get some indication much earlier on about what the long-term performance is going to be in terms of future revenue. And we can see that right now. So by watching the trends in the market share, we'll get an indication. It's not necessarily conclusive, but it certainly is an indication of are things moving in the right direction and approximately with the right velocity. All right, so the key performance indicator here for the CMO then is market share. Now, what the CEO does is he lumps these two together, and this becomes the job of the CIO in a healthy, competitive company where you have a CIO that knows what he's doing. Okay. The CIO is building IT systems. So the strategic IT systems that the CIO is building are having primarily one of two kinds of effects on the company. Either they are decreasing the future expenses of the company, in other words, increasing operational efficiency. Okay? That would be addressing this issue. Or, and sometimes they're increasing the size of the future size of the customer base or sales in the future. Again, why in the future? Because they don't exist yet. You have them under development. They're not going to get rolled out till next year or sometimes a year after that. And even once they're rolled out, there's a ramp up time until they get to become fully operational and you start getting the full business benefit of the new systems. So sometime in the future, the stuff that the CIO is building right now will either be helping to increase the revenue or helping to decrease expenses or both. And those two things, as we see by the equation up here, is profit. And the question that we ask is, so how does the CEO know today that the systems that the CIO has under development will have those positive impacts in the future? Well, if we have an accurate estimate of the internal rate of return of those systems today, then we'll have a good indication of what the future impact is on the systems under development. Now, how do we get a credible IRR on an IT system under development where most of the benefit is going to be intangible? In other words, most of the benefit is going to be on increase in future sales or increase in number of customers or whatever, where we don't have a really solid handle that's obvious to everybody about exactly what that benefit's going to be, how we quantify that. Okay, there are ways of doing that, and that's a topic for a different lecture. But at any rate, we do know how to do that. We can do that credibly, and that's the CIO's job, is to help shepherd that process to make sure that those assessments are done properly and to make sure that the right IT systems are being built to maximize future revenue and future profits. All right, so this just leaves the top equation, and we lump all of this together, and this becomes the domain of the CEO. And this is why the larger the company, the more likely it is that the CEO is not spending very much of his time internal in the company. The CEO is spending the majority of his time external to the company. And and how do we measure the CEO's performance in properly managing investor perception of these numbers? Well, that's measured by stock price, basically. Okay. So this is a business model based on classical business theory that's then been expanded over the last couple of decades as we've increased our understanding of what the full business model needs to look like. And based on that understanding of modern business theory, the CEO has to organize a leadership team to address the entire business model. And so we see that, looking at it from this perspective, he ends up, or she ends up, the CEO ends up at the same place as our previous discussion about he's got to tell the investor community the right kind of story. So whether you approach it from a PR challenge or whether you approach it from a classic business model challenge, you end up with the same solution. On your senior leadership team, you have to at least have these different people, and they have to be tasked this way, and you measure their performance according to the KPIs that I have here on the board. Now let me make a few observations from what I have on the board that I think will provide some insights to some CEOs and other members of the senior leadership team that would be watching this lecture. Sometimes we notice that the VP of sales and the CMO functions are merged into the same person. Either they are the same person and they're tasked with both tasks, or the VP of sales works for the CMO or vice versa. The marketing guy works for the VP of sales. In any one of those three situations, there's something very broken. You are handicapping your organization, and you're handicapping the ability of your organization to build value. As it turns out, these two have to be in tension. In order for you to get the maximum contribution out of your VP of sales and your CMO, you can't give one of those people veto authority over the other, because that's either going to impoverish marketing if the VP of sales is the dominant player, or it's going to impoverish sales if the CMO is the dominant player. And either way, you're impacting growth of the company, and you're impacting the ability of the company to build value. We sometimes see companies where the CIO isn't given this role. We also see companies where this whole second layer is completely missing. In other words, it's like the CEO never got the fact that we're no longer in the 60s and the 70s. And so he doesn't have a separate CMO, and he doesn't have a CIO who's tasked with managing strategic expenses and strategic profits. And consequently, he's missing the whole strategic layer of the business model. And what happens is that company stays fairly stagnant, or at least it grows at a much slower rate than it could grow if you had some very talented members of the senior leadership team properly managing the future health of the company. In a company that's not publicly traded, what we sometimes see is, since the CEO doesn't actually care what Wall Street analysts think about his company, or he doesn't care what the general stock buying public thinks about his company because they're not a publicly traded company, then this top layer gets replaced, and the CEO's attention is not on this, but instead the CEO will oftentimes revert to either being his own CFO or depending on his background, may revert to being one of these other players based on what his major strength is. But I do want you to stop and think for a minute. In those situations, you're actually handicapping the potential growth of the company and the potential health of the company and your ability to build stockholder equity. Even in a privately held company that's not publicly traded, the CEO still has to be concerned with building stockholder equity, I would think. And the other stockholders in the company would think so too, as a general rule. Okay, that's the end of today's lecture. I hope these have provided some valuable insights to better understand what the senior leadership team organization ought to look like, how those people get selected, how those people get managed, and we haven't talked a lot yet about how they cooperate together. I mean, they can't be operating as independent agents here because you won't get the synergies that you need. They really do have to be a team. There has to be a lot of cooperation between these people so that you get the full potential of building stockholder equity in the company. Thank you.